We are living through the biggest economic and geopolitical shift in nearly 100 years, and it's happening right in front of us. The US is undoubtedly headed for an economic downturn while simultaneously ostracizing itself on the world stage, making room for the emergence of a global South alliance. Now, this creates big opportunities and great risk for small businesses. Welcome to my channel. I'm Jice Johnson, business strategist and economic developer. And on this channel, I'm breaking down the intersections of business, leadership, and global affairs so you can stay informed, build strategically, and operate with intention and by design. Now, if this content resonates with you, like it, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. All right, let's dig in. The United States is spiraling economically. Now, not in this like dramatic overnight type of collapse, but in a slow and very predictable trajectory that anyone who is paying attention can see. So, as I have talked about ad nauseum, the debt is unsustainable and the interest payments are outpacing our revenue, which is hanging on by a thread, and our monetary tools are becoming less effective. So, at the same time this is happening, the US is also losing influence globally. And so, when you combine internal financial fragility, which is what we're experiencing, external geopolitical weakening, which is also what we're experiencing, you get a country trying to figure out how to restructure itself while keeping the public calm and in or distracted. And in our case, I think both. I think this is why we're not really hearing about what's happening from a geopolitical perspective, and the fact that we have such polarization within inside of the country is what we're seeing, and that's very distracting to the larger economic issues that we're facing. But this is also why we are seeing a multi-pronged strategy that's emerging, even if our politicians aren't really calling it that. So, right now, what we have are policymakers exploring several approaches. I'm going to talk about three of them today: extending bond maturities, considering gold revaluation, and evaluating stablecoin as a digital settlement tool. Now, these are not like random ideas. There are other nations already utilizing these tools or considering these tools. But what this is that it is a signaling that the old system cannot support itself anymore and that we are in a uh, transition. Now, this is not a temporary downturn, right? We are changing monetary systems and a reset is coming. A reset has to come because a crash is coming. So, what we need to understand is that this is not like a, hey, if we wait out this administration, we'll go back to things at like old business as usual. Old business is gone, it will never return. So, before I get into these three tools, I want to do a quick promo because as I continue to talk about small business and highlight small business as a business strategist and as an organization that supports small businesses, I want to do that in real time here. Especially right now, today I'm recording this on the 29th of November. We are in the middle of a We Ain't Buying It boycott, and we are committing to supporting local and small businesses, in particular Black businesses. I am a habitual buyer from Black businesses. So this is not just because of the boycott. This is because this is my way of life. So with that being said, you can't see the whole shirt. I can't stand up. You can't see the whole shirt. Anyway, this shirt right here, which feels amazing, is by a organization called Beautiful. Beautiful. I am going to drop their information in the description so that you can go and take a look at what they have and support. But I just want to tell you that this is high quality. I love it. And it's quickly becoming one of my favorite sweatshirts. So there's that. The second business I'm going to highlight is one of my own. You're going to hear me talk about it all the time because it is by my very own little people, and that is the A Tribe Adventures. Now, this particular product here is our Mindset Magic Affirmation Card Deck. This is 40 affirmation cards that help build confidence, courage, and curiosity in your little people. And you can see here these affirmation cards. They're high quality, but what they do is they talk about not only the affirmation, but they explain what it is. And this helps to increase the vocabulary of your little people about how they speak to themselves. So you can pick that up at atribeadventures.com, and that will also be in the description below. And I will keep talking about them because that brand right there is my little people, and they're amazing. I'm biased. All right, so let's get back to it. I want to talk about these three. The first one is extending bond maturities. Now, this one I'm not going to talk too much on because I think we get what it looks like to have an extension, right? You owe a debt, you ask for an extension. That's what this is, extending the bond maturities. Really, all this means is that it would just give us more time to pay on the interest, and it could help just alleviate a little bit of the kind of immediacy of what we're experiencing right now, which is overwhelming interest payments, right? So, what this does is it helps to avoid an immediate default, which would create a political crisis. So we absolutely want to avoid a default, and that's simple, right? So the next one that I want to talk about is a gold revaluation. Now, this is a bit bigger, but I'm going to try to break it down in a simple explanation. Okay, so if the price of gold is officially raised, that means that the value of the gold that the US holds is raised. What do we have to do to raise the value? We just have to raise the value. This is much like, let's just say if you own a home. So if you bought a home for $250,000 and then a couple of years later you get that home reappraised and now they tell you it's worth $750,000, just like that. Maybe you haven't done a single thing to it. You haven't upgraded nothing, put a new roof on it, no new paint, no new carpet, nothing. Just revalued. So that's what we're looking at when we talk about revaluing gold. It is an asset and it can change its value, right? So, how does this help the US? Well, if we revalue the gold from where it currently is, then that would strengthen the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. Basically, it would look better on paper and it would help to offset that debt. How does it offset the debt? So, I'm going to use the house example again. I hope this house example makes sense to you. But let's say if you have $100,000 worth of debt and you have a home that's worth $250,000. If you were to try to refinance your home and eat that $100,000, let me back up. Let's say you have a $250,000 debt. I think this might make it a little bit more make a little bit more sense or relate it a little bit better to the US. If you have a $250,000 debt and you have a home that's valued at $250,000, it's very difficult for you to eat that debt with the home, right? I mean, you would be like break even. You couldn't even cover the finance fees for it. So you have a hard time handling that debt with also the value of your home. Let's say again, if your home jumps up to now being worth $750,000, that $750,000 valuation can now refinance and eat that $250,000 worth of debt right on up into its value, right? Into its $750,000 value. Or it could take out, let's say, a line of credit or something like that, right? But you have a lot more leverage because you have this asset on paper that's worth more. And again, maybe you didn't do a single thing to make it worth more. It just is worth more. It's worth more because of time. It's worth more because the neighborhood is better. It's worth more just because it's an asset that appreciates in value. So think about it much like that. The gold has a value. There hasn't been an appraiser to come by and reevaluate the gold to say how much it's worth today. And if they were to come by and reevaluate the gold and say that it's worth more today, right, then that means that the asset goes up on paper and it looks better than in comparison to the debt. So I hope that that example makes sense as to how a gold revaluation could potentially help offset the debt. This has been used before. So a gold valuation is not something that's new. It's been used in other countries. It's been used here in the US. I do think that it weakens the dollar, but also so does printing money. Doing a gold valuation does something very similar to printing money, but without actually printing money, which is why it changes the way that it's perceived. So printing money actually weakens the confidence in the US dollar, but a revaluation of gold could strengthen confidence in the US dollar. So hopefully that makes sense. But that is one of the tools that the US is looking at. Now, the next tool that the US is looking at is stablecoin. Okay. So stablecoin is basically modernizing the our currency. And what it offers is fast, cheap global payments. That's something that's important because I'll talk about how all of these tools affect business, small business here in a minute. But stablecoin offers fast, cheap, and global payments. Okay. It also could offer dollar dominance in the digital market. This is important because there are other currencies that are already in the digital market, but BRICS is working on its own stablecoin options here. And so we'll just put a pin in that, but just know that there's other markets that are trying to figure this out. If the US can make this happen first, which they've already laid the infrastructure for or the groundwork for, then this can help establish dollar dominance inside of the digital market space, which would then increase demand for US treasuries, because part of why we're experiencing some of what we're experiencing is because there is a weakening of demand for US treasuries right now. Okay. So this could help to like shore that back up. It can also shore up liquidity again without printing money. So the US is looking at ways that it can make some of these things happen without printing money. And this matters because stablecoins can extend the reach of the dollar. So they basically just give the US dollar like a foothold in the global digital payment space. Okay. All right. So I do want to acknowledge that like stablecoins are not crypto. And I think this is important because a lot of times when I'm listening to other folks that are in the marketplace talk about what's happening in this digital space, I think that there's not a lot of room to acknowledge that a significant amount of people are not into digital currencies at all. And so it feels like it's a foreign language. And it is. We're talking about something that's tangible that you can hold, like a dollar, versus something that is digital, right? And so it creates a lot of confusion in that way. And I just want to acknowledge that. So I want to talk about that just for a minute, right? Stablecoins are not part of the crypto hype. They are a strategic tool. They could allow for the US to export the dollar more efficiently. And again, as I said, increase treasury demand. That's going to be really important, right? But also, it helps to move the US into the next stage of global, like a global financial restructuring or architecture. So, bottom line here, um, it's just to understand why the US is moving in this direction, right? It's like we also need to understand what's happening globally, especially with BRICS and the rise of this kind of multipolar world. So before we go deeper into how the US might use these tools, I just, like I said, want to clear up because I feel like I'm not quite hitting the nail on the head with the crypto versus stablecoin. So let me just share this up. Bitcoin or other cryptos, right? This is not the same thing as a stable coin. The difference here really does matter. What Bitcoin is, I'm using Bitcoin as an example because it's the most well-known crypto, right? But like what Bitcoin is more free floating. It's not pegged to anything. It's not pegged to dollars, it's not pegged to gold, it's not pegged to commodities, right? So its value really just moves purely based off of supply and demand. When they created Bitcoin, they created it with a limited amount, so it creates a supply and demand. It automatically creates a supply and demand market, right? And it behaves much more like a digital version of gold. There is a limited supply, therefore there it creates demand. Now it's a lot more volatile, right? Which is great for investment, but is not necessarily what we want to look at when we're talking about stability. So try to think of Bitcoin much like an asset and not like a settlement tool. Okay. Now, stablecoin is really what I'm saying it is. It's stable. So it's pegged to something, right? So in this case, we're talking about pegging it to a US dollar or pegging it to US treasuries, typically in like a one-to-one fashion. So $1 equals one stable coin, and that's what that's what stabilizes, right? The stable coin. So I just want to acknowledge like the stable coin is designed to stay stable, whereas something like Bitcoin can definitely be more volatile and fluctuate. Um, this distinction really does matter because um, the US is, even when we just talked about like the gold revaluation, the US is looking at gold revaluation, right? It's also looking at Bitcoin as an asset to help stabilize, or not to help stabilize, but to help balance that debt. The US would not use something like Bitcoin to stabilize the system, right? Because it's too volatile, but they can use stable coins. So I just want to make that distinction, because Bitcoin could like hedge against the debt and stable coin could be used as like a tool, right? So anyway, I'm only saying that because again, whenever I'm listening to different folks talk about like what's happening in the digital currency world, what happens when I come offline and I'm talking to like an everyday person who isn't in the digital space, it's really confusing And so I don't know if I did a great job with that. You can have a conversation with me in the comments and I'll try to, continue to clear it up. But we do need to understand what this looks like. This is also not the same thing as using a CBDC or a central bank digital currency. Stablecoin has maybe some light surveillance, but again, it's really more like a rail, whereas like a CBDC or a central backed digital. I don't know why I just lost the acronym of a CBDC in real time, but you get what I'm saying. A CBDC is an issue of surveillance, right? And so, like, we need to understand the difference in all of these so that when we're talking again about policy and legislation, we have an understanding of what it is that we're talking about. And there are too many people who don't understand the digital currency world just yet to make solid fiscal voting decisions, essentially. So I feel like I just went down the weeds. I'm gonna try to bring it back, y'all. All right. So I just wanted to talk about the difference there so that we can be clear about what it is that we're talking about. And we do need to understand the differences. So I'm going to keep going, and that's going to bring me to why stablecoin could matter so much for US small businesses, right? So now, again, a tool. Stablecoin is like a tool. How the US uses that tool, but it is a tool. So everything I'm talking about, though, gold valuation, bond maturities, stable coins, right? These are not, these are not abstract. These shifts have direct impacts on how small businesses operate. And I want to talk about that before we start talking about BRICS. So one is faster, cheaper payments. Okay, so stablecoin can allow for instant settlement, not in like 2 to 5 days. And they can do this for very minimal fees, not the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7% that you might get from these payment processors, right? Especially when you start stacking these payment processors on top of each other. Now, for small businesses, right, what this could look like is faster cash flow, and faster cash flow could be the difference, especially for a small business, in between like surviving and shutting down. Now, another thing is that it can help to open up global customers, right? So they can become more accessible. Stable coins could remove currency conversion fees and wire transfer delays, and could really help with getting through like some of the international banking hurdles, right? So like this looks like a solopreneur in Atlanta might sell something to someone in like a Kenya or a Brazil or in India instantly without having to go through like PayPal or even going through the whole rigmarole of like trying to set up their wire transfers and all those extra fees and all of that, right? So stablecoin could eliminate a lot of that. Another thing that it can do is it can help really protect from like banking volatility. So as we understand, when there are financial or economic downturns, right? What we have seen in the past are things like bank freezes, especially because the bank might try to stop things like a bank run. So with something like stablecoin, it really just can hedge against that, um, because it is not, it's digital. It's not like actually tied up in the bank, right? And then it can also create new funding channels. So what this could look like, and this might be the thing that excites me the most, is it could open up the opportunity for like global lenders or crypto native investors or DeFi liquidity pools. It could open up things for like cross-border credit options, right? And so I'm going to take another pause here to acknowledge that we're talking about a lot of financial concepts at once. And quite frankly, when I talk to small businesses, a lot of small businesses are just not up on what all these things mean. And I can't introduce too many concepts all at once. So stick with me, hit the like, subscribe, share button, right? Do all those YouTube things so that you can keep coming back and we can keep breaking down exactly what these things are, because this is a big part of financial literacy. And quite frankly, the digital finance world has added another layer to financial literacy that didn't exist not so long ago. So we have to keep talking about these things. And while I can't break down what crypto native investors are, if you've never heard of DeFi, like I can't get into all of that today, it's important to know that these things exist and then we can keep breaking them down. Okay. So that's what I'm here for, is to help continue to grow and learn in this space. But ultimately what this means is that small businesses aren't stuck with local banks, especially banks that have historically and presently rejected us, despite how many tools they keep creating to help get capital into the hands of small businesses, right? I'm so sick of hearing about access to capital, and I have access to capital programs in my own organization. It's just frustrating because what we know is that they haven't done a good job, despite all the access to capital talk, of actually loosening capital for Black-owned businesses and for other historically marginalized businesses. So that's one that I'm very excited about what stablecoin could create. So anyway, at the end of the day, right, it can create a lot more global opportunities. And I think that that part is very important. And it can create some supply chain opportunities, or some supply chain. It can create, like, it can make the supply chain more accessible, is maybe a better way to put it. So this gives us an opportunity to really kind of speak with our cousins across the water in a way that's that starts to X out a lot of the previous barriers that we had. So we're not competing just locally anymore, right? We are really talking about how we open up ourselves into a global marketplace, and I think that that's really important. So we have to understand that we're entering an era where entrepreneurs, small businesses, have to think in macro terms. You have to think in macro terms in terms of trade, currency, payment rails, supply chain, and all of that. It's the only way that we're going to stay competitive and the only way we're going to stay resilient. So I want to look into and move on into talking about why you have to think this way, right? Is because of the rise of really the rise of BRICS, right? But what does BRICS represent? BRICS represents a multipolar world. It represents a removal of the US kind of being the central factor of like world economics. And it opens us up for the opportunity to see a changing of the rules globally, but not like a shifting from like one dominant country to another dominant country, but instead one dominant country to many countries having greater access and agency. So we have to like zoom out, right? The US isn't operating in a vacuum. The global power is shifting, and really BRICS is at the center of what this looks like. So BRICS, let's talk about what BRICS actually is. BRICS started with Brazil, Russia, India, China. Then it added South Africa. Okay, so that's what the acronym stands for. If you're not already familiar with that, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But now it has expanded to include Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Indonesia, and it has a second tier. So those are kind of like the BRICS members, right? But then it also has this partner tier. And this partner tier has a lot of other nations like Nigeria and Thailand and Venezuela, right? So there are all these countries that have come together kind of under the umbrella of BRICS. Even if they are not members, they are partners and they are observer nations. So they are basically saying we recognize this BRICS alliance as an economic alliance. So this is not like a small coalition anymore, right? This is truly a global economic force. And I remember, a couple years ago, really, when first hearing about BRICS and then realizing like nobody in the US is really talking about BRICS. And it was like, yeah, BRICS is not new. Like BRICS has been around for BRICS has been around for over a decade, but it's really starting to take form and take shape because what you have is all these countries who don't have a lot in they don't have a lot in common except for their goal to reduce US dependency or US dollar dependency, right? And so it took them some time to like build trust and build structure and really form like what it was that they were trying to do and what it was that they were trying to create, especially because it was really important to acknowledge again that like there's not one dominant country and now shifting to like another dominant country, right? Which is kind of like what initially we had assumed, like, or at least I had assumed, like I had assumed that like China was trying to take control or Russia was trying to take control, but really none of them are trying to do that. What they're trying to do is actually create not like a single new currency, but they want multipolarity. They want to have a world that has many centers of economic power, and so they are building that, right? They are building alternative payment systems that are commodity backed trade options, but that are not backed by the dollar, right? So this is, I'm gonna stop myself from going down a rabbit hole, but what I'm gonna say is this is why the US is focused in on Nigeria, because Nigeria has agreed to take yuan in addition to, not instead of, in addition to the petrodollar, right? But this is what it gets into. This is how the US continues to destabilize these countries, because the US does not want other countries relying on anything other than the US dollar. This is how the US has maintained so much of its control. So anyway, so BRICS listen, they have new supply chain alliances, they have new investment institutions, they are opening up trade corridors outside of US control. This is major. And this is important, right, to small businesses, because in a multipolar world, the US not being the center of that global trade means that it is now just one of several nodes. And you have to, like, if you're going to run a business today, right, this means that you need to be thinking like someone who is operating in this world where the US is not the center anymore. This means that there are global customers, global suppliers, but it also means that there's global risk, right? And it also means that there's global opportunity. Risk and opportunity for small businesses is very important to balance out, because oftentimes we are operating with a smaller set of resources. So it's important that we understand the risk, but also that we don't shy away from the opportunities. So what businesses need to be thinking about right now is how to diversify their markets. So start studying the currency trends and start to understand what the new payment rails mean. Start to understand and monitor what's happening geopolitically, right, and across borders, because this is where the opportunity is. This is where the opportunity is. So that means that we have to build flexibility into our operations, right? So this isn't really just about like being multinational or whatever. It's really just about being macro aware. It's about how we raise our awareness as small businesses competing in a very much of a global economy. This is what this means. So the rest of the world is reorganizing itself. It is building around the US, and I'm not going to talk about this in my next video. I'm gonna push this down the road like a video or two, but I want to talk about the G20 and the B20 summits that took place. I want to talk about what that looks like for us thinking on the global stage, right? And so give me a little bit to break that down. But we have to take a really hard look at like what's been happening here, right? The US is not just lost power globally. We have weakened our own collective power internally. And I think this is really important. Again, I'm talking about this right after Thanksgiving, during this big shopping holiday for the US, and we are in the middle of a we ain't buying it boycott, right? And I've already talked about this. Like, we can do this boycott. I'm all for boycotting. I'm very intentional about my dollars, very intentional about where I spend my dollars. If I started talking about all the companies that I don't support, it's wild. But what I also recognize is that there are places that I can't avoid, and that's because we have a weakened collective power. That weakening didn't just come from outside forces. It has come from decades of poor fiscal policy and poor political choices that we have allowed to hollow out the economic strength of everyday people, right? Like, this is in my opinion, this is big. And this is what I say, like, we don't have a strong agenda that we're paying attention to that allows for us to be thinking about how we have been weakened collectively. And so we get out here and we protest and we get out here and we boycott, but it's difficult because for years we have had leaders that have passed legislation that has benefited these corporations. It's consolidated wealth and it has destroyed the structures that protect working people. And we have allowed the same political class to sit in power for decades. We have allowed the McConnells and the Pelosi's and the Schumers and the Jeffries to weaken our unions, right, which was one of the strongest tools for economic protection, wage negotiation, collective leverage, right? They have done this through deliberate policy deregulation, anti-labor laws, weakened bargaining rights, right? Our unions have been gutted. These issues are antithetical to pro-Black power movements, right? It's like we forgot how we got here. So we've gotten very eloquent in our outrage, right? But our political and our legislative stance is weak AF, y'all. It's weak. So we do not have a strong agenda to address how to move beyond this, which is why they have been strengthening these monopolies. So as they've weakened our as they've weakened our unions, right, and our ability to collectively advocate, like we forgot how we got here, but they haven't forgotten. Every time we have come together as a people and have been able to make major moves, they have strengthened their resolve to ensure that we cannot have collective power, right? So it's like antitrust enforcement has completely collapsed. And we live in a country where there are a handful of corporations that control entire industries: food, tech, media, healthcare, transportation. And it is not a free market, it is a monopoly, right? And so this is why when we try to boycott, it's very difficult to boycott because everything is owned by the same people. Everything is owned by the same people. So you don't shop at that, you don't shop there, you shop over here. That's just the difference in how they branded it. It's all, the ownership all flows up to the same people. So politicians have been allowed to enrich themselves while they have eroded the power of the everyday citizen. And so I think that, when we're really thinking about this and looking at what's happening in the US, and they're talking about democracy has failed, right? Democracy didn't fail, right? The people who are running democracy have failed. And the version of capitalism that we live under today is so distorted, right? It's a very corporatist version of capitalism that they've created that says it's profit over everything. So anyway, they learned and they've adjusted their strategies, and we have forgotten how we have gotten here. So with that being said, if we want to really think about, I'm going to wrap this up here. If we want to really be thinking about our power, right, we cannot keep waiting for these systems to fix themselves. They have not fixed themselves. They fixed themselves to ensure that we cannot fix them. They have fixed themselves to enrich themselves and to keep consolidating more and more power at the top. They have not created the legislation and the policies that are needed to generate wealth and then to push it back down. And at some point, I'm gonna make a note of this, that we need to actually talk about what economic development is, because economic development is the method by which you create wealth in the region. And so they have done a great job of creating the mechanisms to create wealth, but they've consolidated it all at the top and have not done a good job. They've not done any job of pushing it down. So I believe that we really need to focus on building parallel markets. And this is not like some light bulb idea. If you go back into like Powernomics, for example, Dr. Claude Anderson talks about these verticals that need to be created. But ultimately, we need to create these parallel markets. We need to have new models of production and distribution and capital and community that are not dependent on the monopolies or dependent on these like political ridiculous dynasties that have been created. We have to solve for real world problems. And quite frankly, I believe that the growth that the African nations are seeing is really just coming from that. It's coming from people who have been systematically held down for so long that as that boot has been lifted off their neck, they are having to think about how to create solutions to real world problems. And really, we can learn from that, right? So there's a lot that our cousins across the water can teach us, and there's a lot that we can learn from them. There's a lot that they can learn from us. So I think that we have to be thinking about this moment in true partnership, right? And I have to say that because, especially if you're American, we have an elitist mindset. That's something that we have gotten from this Western culture. It's terrible, but we have to come in the form of partnership. So I'm going to be breaking down parallel markets in my next video, right? So, like thinking about how they work, why we need them, and how small businesses and communities can start building them. So, if this resonated with you, I want you to go ahead and do what you do, all that YouTube stuff. I want you to like, subscribe, share with someone, and join me again in my next video. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss it, right? But join me in my next video and let's talk about parallel markets.